Hello. This screencast is designed to support students studying the edXL IGCSE or certificate courses in their study of Wilfred Owen's poem Disabled. And the genesis of it is that it was designed to support a group working on the poem as part of a coursework essay for the first time. My intention in the screencast is not to in any way prepare students for their coursework essay in the sense that they just have to write what they hear, but is to talk through the way in which I might address a question such as the one on the title slide. How does Owen evoke sympathy for the wounded soldier in Disabled? Because of the software that I'm using, some of the screens don't appear in full and the images are not there. My recommendation is that you both watch and simply listen to what I'm saying with a copy of the poem in front of you so that you can make notes. We have a poem, a very well-known poem by Owen. I haven't placed the whole lot on this slide because I'm assuming that everybody will have their own copies. And we have a question asking us to consider how and why this poem is so effective. Well, as always, in this kind of writing, the focus of the student should always be on the writer's choices. And in this case, it seems to me that one of the ways to approach a How Does Owen Use essay is to start by replacing the how with what. Put simply, if you don't know really what the themes are or the ideas are that Owen has included in this poem specifically to help a reader feel sympathy for the soldier, then you haven't really got a chance of working out how he does it. So it seems to me that an essay of about 1,200 words, 1,500 words, or put it another way, an essay of the length that you would write in 45 to 50 minutes in an examination, we might want 4 or so clear points, and I've chosen 4 for my purposes. And they are the juxtaposition of past and present, the attitude of women, and the attitude to women, physical emasculation, and isolation. And what I intend to do is work through each one in turn in the hope that we'll get an idea or two about how this might work. Don, you're going to need for a while just to bear with me as the screen is not fully replenishing, or of course if you're listening on the separate sound file, well, you haven't lost anything. So we'll start off by looking at juxtaposition of past and present. And remember, at the moment we're just really trying to see what Owen is setting up. This poem seems structured in such a way that there is a constant contrast between the present, the state of the disabled soldier, and the past running throughout. And you should be aware of this in terms of writing about the basic structure. For example, our hero sits in his wheeled chair at the beginning of the poem, and one of the devices we'll notice is the repeated refrain of voices of boys that come at the beginning of a pair of consecutive lines. Owen is very definitely trying to use this idea of the man who is trapped in his room, hearing people enjoying themselves, yet unable to go out and see what is happening. He wants them to be voices of boys simply because we have to remember how young our soldier is, perhaps. And running of these, together with the verb mothering, when sleep eventually comes to him, suggesting some sense of care, some sense of protection, perhaps, should remind us of exactly what the soldier at the heart of this poem is missing. Interestingly, of course, it is placed straight before the section of the poem dealing with what it used to be like in town. And we get this sense of juxtaposition of past and present. Another place that we see it is in the discussion of the smear of blood on his leg that used to signify, well, heroism, great sporting heroism, which comes immediately after the savagely clear description of the spurt of purple coming from his thigh as the wound happens. Again, the two are crammed one on top of the other. Now comes first, and how things used to be comes second. And we'll talk again about some of those images later on. Another thing to look for here, in terms of before and after, is the way that Owen is so careful to point out in clear detail the injury that the soldier has, legless, single word opening a line. And yet, when this boy joined the army, one of the reasons he joined was because he would look a god in kilts. The irony of Owen deciding to write about a soldier in a Highland regiment wearing a kilt, a piece of clothing which of course shows off the bare legs of the wearer, is hard to ignore. And again, the sympathy is clear in the way that it is generated. So we've talked already about three elements of juxtaposition that we could write about in more detail when we get to write. And I'd like you to think, perhaps, if you were planning an essay of structuring, that we might go with, as the last of the three almost, the one I started with, the voices that we hear. Because the voices seem to me to link to isolation. This idea of the man being on his own, this idea that he is stuck in a room with no means of getting out of it. If we allow ourselves that link, then we have to look and see how Owen presents the isolation. And of course, we might start off with developing this idea of the voices ringing through the park and the man on his own. But look then at some of the images that he uses in that first stanza. The man is described as being in his ghastly suit of grey, waiting for dark. We know he's on his own, we've highlighted that. Why is his suit grey? And this use of colour imagery is something that Owen will do a great many times in this poem. Grey is a washed out, tired colour. It's a colour that almost seems to suggest that everything has been removed from it. It isn't, I think, a colour representative of death. Black would be a colour representative of death, and somehow that's too easy, that's too convenient. Our soldier isn't dead. He's on the edge of limbo almost, in his grey, monochrome, washed-out suit. He's waiting for dark, and yes, he may well simply be waiting for night-time and being able to go to sleep and be mothered, but of course, he's obviously also waiting for death. The only thing that life has for him now is dark. He is isolated and he is on his own. He's been on his own since he returned from France. Only a solemn man approached him and inquired about his soul, to use a couple of short quotes. And again, this sense of isolation, I think, is strong. We know that Owen lost his faith, really, during the war, as did many soldiers at this time. And I find it interesting that the solemn man, not clearly described as being a clergyman, approaches the soldier in the place of anybody who might legitimately be expected to be supporting him, family, his Meg, we'll come to her later, and inquired about his soul, because it seems to me that, given Owen's frame of mind, there could hardly be anything less relevant to this man than an inquiry about his soul. He's lost his legs, his life has been turned into a living nightmare, and the man is interested in his soul. Of course, if Owen is implying that this is a question that cannot be answered because, frankly, he has lost his faith, again, the man is further isolated from a very Christian country, in a country which believes in, God being an Englishman and leading the forces to war. Now, that might be a little extreme, but I think it's an avenue to explore. At the end of the poem, of course, the isolation is brought on again very, very clearly. We're told to imagine how cold and late it is, not only in the time of day, but perhaps how close he is to death. How cold it is, how unwelcoming, how unkind. And there's the double rhetorical question of the two final lines. Why don't they come and put him to bed? Who's asking us this? Is this the soldier's thoughts? Or is it the voice of the omniscient narrator who has hitherto told us the story of the poem. You can decide that, and it's a question. It is an accusatory question, possibly, of why is he being left all alone. But I think the important thing is the repetition of why don't they come. Those monosyllables that crash through the last line. Why don't they come? And I think this is a different question, because I think this is a question aimed at us, aimed at anybody reading this page who is being encouraged to consider their own guilt, if you like, as they also seek to put these ruined husks of men, as Owen would have seen them, out of their mind and pretend that they're not there. The isolation that shuts them away. And to me, this is a direct challenge almost to the reader to look into themselves and actually ask themselves the question, why don't people, us, support these men more strongly? And I think, again, it's clear to see how that would develop a degree. As the poem moves on, we talked briefly earlier about Meg, and this attitude to and of women, I think, is very, very important. Again, Owen sets up various ideas. He sets up the juxtaposition that he'll never feel how slim women's waists are, girls' waists are. And his sensory perception, which has been so curtailed by the war, is balanced, if you like, by the fact that all of them touch him like some queer disease. He can no longer touch, feel, appreciate women. They can touch and feel him, but they don't. They treat him as some pariah to be avoided. Juxtaposition of past and present, perhaps, or just juxtaposition of ideas. We've already talked about when he joined up, his idea was to impress. And he was encouraged by all the girls to do so. He'd look a god in kilts. He joined up to please his Meg. Somehow his Meg was a driving force behind him joining up. And do we not sympathise for him, therefore, because of the fact that the very people who have encouraged him to join up, above all, are the people who are absent from his life now? Indeed, the women's eyes, we're told, pass from him to men that were whole. And Owen, as often in the diction in this poem, is so clear about what is happening. This image of men that were whole is a wonderful image. It focuses us directly on the injury without engaging in any hyperbolic descriptions of wound. What it draws our attention to is the pieces that are missing. And this sense that women are passing from him to men that are whole, rejecting this man who has done what they wanted him to do, is something that Owen is very, very clear about. And again, it carries on through into the why don't they come double question, but also can be seen in moments such as the verb mothered, when talking about the sleep that looks after him. Again, that helps to emphasise the absence of his mother, of his parents, from this conversation. The soldier is young. We know that. He's not 19 when he joins up. We know that he looks younger than that, because of the artist who is silly for his face. And yet there is no sense that he is being loved or looked after by those who should look after him. And that, to Owen, is women. Not only that, but the men that were whole takes us to this idea of physical emasculation, this idea of him being destroyed. And there's many things to look at here, not just the stark opening of the wheeled chair, but also the wonderful description of his clothing with the line broken by caesure, with legless, sewn short at elbow, and these two phrases that are themselves somehow shortened and shrunken phrases that lack verbs, that lack articles, just as he himself lacks limbs, drives us in that way. Telling us about his youth, Owen brings us up short with a half line, again the caesura, now he is old. And the power of those simple, straightforward monosyllables, does far more than any long-winded description of the way he now seems to have aged or lost his strength can come to him. We talked about the kilt being a strong and powerful image, and yes, indeed it is. It draws our attention to what is missing that we can see. But also, in conjunction with that, we have to recall that he threw away his knees. There's a wonderful idea here of carelessness. And I think it relates not just to, the idea purely of carelessness, but this idea of teenagers who think that they are invincible, who will take risks that they should never take and suffer. There is a carelessness in this. It's also a sense of waste. What has his sacrifice been for? He's thrown away his knees, and he's treated like some strange outsider. Not only has he thrown away his knees in this area, but we can look again at how he has poured out his colour. The choice of verb for the wound suggesting great barrels of blood being poured down these shell holes. And Owen uses the word colour instead of blood, this sense of a euphemistic idea that his colour, of course, is also his life blood. And it's his colour that has gone when he's sitting in his ghastly suit of grey. The wound itself is described graphically, with the leap of purple that spurted from his thigh. And we have to understand here the sense here of the idea of the leap of purple, this noun implying some huge jet. The colour purple, it's said, I'll discuss in a moment. The verb spurted, the power of that verb and how it's created, is again this moment to capture in, 5, 6 words, the moment of impact of some ghastly piece of shrapnel into the boy's leg is so powerful that we can't help but be drawn. Now, having looked at what Owen does, we have to look at how he does it. And when we're doing this, I'm not going to go through every single example. Frankly, you'll be here till next Thursday. But we need to remember that, first of all, no word is accidental in a poem. Every word has been weighed up. And we know that in many of Owen's poems that he had time to revise, he worked very, very hard to achieve the exact wording that he wished. So we have no reason to assume that he's not done the same here. We know, because of what I've been saying, but also we know the typical devices that he might use: metaphor, simile, juxtaposition, rhyme, para-rhyme, and so on. And we also know a lot of the areas we want to talk about. So the next step into the idea of how Owen creates what he does and how we write about the choices he makes. And to do this, I need you to think about zooming in when you're analysing. Some of you P, some of you PQE, some of you Pearl, some of you do whatever you do when you're writing essays. I like Pearl, I think it works. The A and the R, if you're not familiar with it, essentially represent the second E of Ping, or the E of PQE. And I think this is a pattern that's worth aiming for. We make our point, we provide evidence in the form of a quotation, and make sure that quotation is a few words, ideally, because it will make it easier to do what I want you to do. Then, to analyse, we zoom into the key word, and we show the reader that we're able to explain why Owen chose this word and what he was trying to achieve. If we can do that, we can relate it to the question, and then link our way into what we want to say next. So, we look at it something like this, and I apologise for the way the boxes are obscuring the text slightly. I'm going to start off with a clear point. Owen highlights the drama of the moment that the soldier was wounded. When he writes, it's a clear point, I'm highlighting the drama of the moment of the wound. And the quotation then comes in, leap of purple spurted from his thigh. At this point, I need to start to zoom in, and this is where this happens. Having given a full quotation, I can now zoom in to the rest of what I need to achieve, and that will require, as I zoom in on the screen in front of me, a piece of work. And what I've gone with here is this. Here, I say, the choice of the noun purple To replace blood is important, I say, as purple is a colour with connotations of royalty and high status. And there they are, floating around on the page in front of you if you're looking at the screencast. Bit of a mess, I'm sorry. That is a pretty good explanation, it seems to me, of why purple was chosen. Moving on, to relate it back to the question, of course, Owen here is showing this soldier, however anonymous, is a noble young man and therefore deserves our sympathy. I've related back to the question. And at this point I could move on, but there's actually another thing I want to say about this quotation. So I'm going to go into another key word, and that key word then that I'm moving into next is the word spurted. Because it's worth talking about it, if only just to show a little bit of technical proficiency. The plosive, that's any consonant sound that's formed with the sort of spitting out motion of the lips. The plosive of spurted serves to heighten the graphic nature of the wound, which takes away his legs. It's worth putting that in. It's showing that I can engage with language choice and why certain words were used. If you want to go further and liken the spurted sound to maybe the impact of the bullet, by all means, explore ideas for yourself. I then move to link with the sympathy of the reader is further evoked by reference to him having thrown away. And on we go. A passage allow you to see how a good paragraph, not a perfect paragraph at all, will work. So far I've talked about what I think he does, and I've shown you how I would expect you to write about what he does, combining both a zooming in analysis of discussion perhaps of the colour imagery of purple, but also a comment about the language choice. Other ideas we could play with might well be this purple for status and royalty in the colour, linking the colour idea to ghastly grey and monochrome, waiting for dark, light blue trees in the juxtaposition of the town. Everything was gay, it says, and light blue, airy, freedom. And this euphemism for blood as he lost his colour. And perhaps allows the reader to visualise the torrent that pours out of him. And I'm interested at this point, just to make mention in the poem, by the fact that Owen seems to wish to euphemize death. He's very, very gentle about the way he portrays death. He portrays it through colour and doesn't say the words. He's very, very stark about the clarity with which he describes the wounds. And this is deliberate. He wants us to focus on this man as a disabled man and how we're treating him, not as a figure who is about to die. Other images that we might want to play with in the time before, the glow lamps budded, this sense of the new hope perhaps, and possibly ironic that we're looking at future and rebirth, which is what budding is, given that the man has been so emasculated. The beautiful alliteration of half his lifetime lapsed. Lapsed. Such a gentle word to describe the excising of half a man's life. But just like his arm, his life has been cut in half. The army always interests people. Smiling, they wrote his lie, and those two I vowels, that assonance of that, which is a vowel assonance not really seen in the poem other than there, is interesting again. Why are they smiling? Most students, and I think a lot of commentators, view this as the army complicit in taking young men to their slaughter. But I think we have to look all the way round, and I think there's two things that come to mind here. At the time that this was being written, 1917, the army was desperate for recruits. The arrival of a fit, healthy young man at the recruiting office would have made recruiting officers smile, particularly when that young man, so confident, so brazen, just lies about his age to join the army. I don't think we have to see this as deeply hostile to the army. There is always more than one way to look. Sleep mothered him from him. Yes, sleep is kind, eventually spares him the pain of hearing the voices. But as I said earlier, he's still very young, and what we have our attention drawn to is the fact that his mother is no longer there. Students who are studying this in terms of a coursework essay, it's worth remembering again. Edexcel do not put a limit on the number of words. But you should be aiming for around 1200. There's frankly no point in much more. If you can't make yourself clearly understood in 1200, you're not going to make yourself clearly understood in 2000 or whatever. The focus for this essay is AO2, and I've put the subheadings there beneath it on the slide for you to see. Here they are. You need numbers 1 and 3 for the purposes of this essay. That is, read and understand and make some evaluation of how writers use linguistic and structural devices, etc., etc., etc. Does it work? How effective is it? Ideally, there's a short introduction with maybe 4 areas of discussion, and they could be the ones that I've highlighted. They could be other ones. You could choose to focus on his use of colour imagery, on his use of setting, or whatever it might be. That's entirely up to you. The points I've discussed are all relevant within any of the structures you care to use. And a brief conclusion will recap the sympathy that is created and listing, if you like, the techniques that do it. Remember that they are very clear. The highest marks go to those who show independent thought processes. Before I finish, one last slide. One of the writers, the pedagogical writers that I have had the most interest in the last few years is a man called Ron Berger. A book of his, An Ethic of Excellence. Now, there is a YouTube clip, which I will attach to the blog post where I post this, that outlines his idea about the importance of drafting. You can Google it yourself. It's called Austin's Butterfly. And it's the story of a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, creating a miniature work of art by redrafting and by targeted critical help. I want you to watch it. I'll put the link on my blog post. I want you to watch this. Because actually, this will show you why it is so vital that you do draft and receive critical feedback before you draft again. I wish you the best of luck with your writing, and I hope that if you found this useful, you'll look at other material on the blog or on the YouTube site, as well as pop in and see me at some point just to ask what else you can do to improve your work. Thank you for listening.